So it was interesting because when Stella got the invitation to come to this panel on police brutality, we thought, okay, this is a bit of a humdinger to explain where we're at with police brutality. I would say in the early years of Stella, in the 90s, actual police physical and sexual violence was much more common than it is today. We had police officers who were taking sex workers and dropping them off in the freezing cold on top of the mountain with no shoes, dropping them off under the bridge in the middle of the night, much like the Starlight tours that killed an Aboriginal man in, I believe, in the prairies. Was that Saskatchewan? We also had sexual coercion that was enforced by the criminalization of sex work, which is to say that police officers would say, I won't send you to jail if you give me a blowjob, if you fuck me, i.e. you won't lose custody of your children, you won't lose your apartment, blah, 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 if you do this. So that form of sexual coercion, to the point that I remember in the 90s when the police had announced their police de quartier, and the slogan was une police proche de ses citoyens, so a police that's close to its citizens. And so we had made a mock, the Coalition for the Rights of Sex Workers, not Stella, had made a mock poster that said the police close to its citizens, and had a picture of a sex worker giving a blowjob to a policeman. And then it said, you know, the coalition is against sexual assault. That's changed a lot, and I feel it's important to say it. I feel it's important because I work on police rape and police battery issues in many other countries where they're present on a completely different scale. I was working with Ukrainian sex worker groups this year in collaboration with Human Rights Watch to protect the lives of sex workers and outreach workers after the police allegedly murdered sex workers who wouldn't pay them off. It's a different scale. Incidentally, those police officers were from the anti-trafficking division, just to give you some perspective. But it's a different scale. That said, there are forms of violence and there are forms of brutality that are very present in sex workers' lives. And I want to sort of explain a little bit more about what those are. First of all, police intimidation, harassment, humiliation is very common, particularly of trans sex workers, of homeless sex workers, of Aboriginal sex workers. So comments like a few weeks ago downtown when they were arresting Aboriginal women on the street, like, why don't you just throw yourself off the bridge already? That kind of humiliation and hatred. That if you're at a point in your life where things are really rough, is extremely hurtful and painful and extremely powerful. What I think you do need to understand, though, is that the everyday brutality that is facing sex workers, particularly on the street where they're the most criminalized, is criminalization, is police repression. It's the violence inherent in the fact that you're being confined and sent away to prison. If you're a trans woman being sent to a male prison where the risk of sexual assault is extremely high, and it's an extremely humiliating and degrading process. It's the inherent violence in being confined in a prison if you're a woman, where if you're a drug user and their drugs or prisons are full of drugs, you have no access to clean needles in Canada, such that most prisoners, not most, a lot of prisoners are coming out with HIV and Hep C, in some cases most. There's a provincial prison in BC, again, with a disproportionately high rate of Aboriginal prisoners, where upon coming out they do tests and over 90% of the inmates had hepatitis C. That is the violence of criminalization, that is the brutality of criminalization. And it goes beyond the individual police officer to the laws that they are enforcing, that we as a society are asking them to enforce. It's the brutality of losing custody of your children if you don't have status of being deported once you're arrested. It's the brutality of the fact that there is no safe place to take tricks in the city. There's no safe place to go so that you'd be protected. Jamie Lee Hamilton, a trans Aboriginal sex worker in Vancouver, had opened Granny's house in the downtown east side in the basement of a church during the height of the Picton murders, so that women had a safe place to take their tricks. And the police busted it because she was denouncing the fact that they were not acting quick enough to investigate the murders because the women were Aboriginal and sex workers and often homeless. It also affects housing. There's no proper shelter for trans women in the city, whether they're homeless or victims of violence. There's no proper shelter for women who are drug using in the city, which means that we are forcing them to sleep, if they're still using drugs and if they're not ready to get clean, we're forcing them to sleep in the crack houses, in the piols, the shooting galleries, which means that we're essentially putting them in a situation where it's very common that they're being sexually assaulted in the night. That is the brutality that is so common. That is the brutality of repression that we're seeing so often. That also creates a situation of complete impunity for violence against criminalized people. Be they sex workers, again, be they homeless, be they drug users. So to give you an example of, again, early from the 90s, there's a woman who was very involved with Stella and who was involved also as an activist in the Coalition for the Rights of Sex Workers, who was raped on the street. And in the hospital bed, when she was getting the rape kit done, the police came in and started to interrogate her about a warrant she had for prostitution-related charges. The police were supposed to be investigating, showing up on the hospital bed to help look for a rapist, right? On a structural level, another sex worker who was an activist, who was homeless, who was a drug user, who was a member of the coalition, was stabbed 17 times in downtown Montreal, and she survived miraculously. The police arrived at the scene because people called the police. But the police didn't press charges. They didn't write it up in the night as attempted murder. They didn't write it up as sexual assault. No, sorry, that wasn't sexual assault, as an assault with a deadly weapon. So when she got out of hospital and was trying to get victims' compensation from the Quebec Victims' Compensation Board to help with physiotherapy and counseling, she was denied, first of all, because there was no police record. And so Stella fought for there to be a police record, and what we found is that the police had written up the event in what's called the notes of the night. It's where you write up, like, it was really snowy tonight, or it was really cold, or so there it was, you know, prostitute stabbed 17 times. So the next step is we got a lawyer who volunteered to take her case to EVAC, which is the Victims' Compensation Board. And she was denied compensation because they said, it's your fault. You're a sex worker, you know the risks inherent to sex work, which we incidentally do not believe are inherent to sex work, we believe are inherent to criminalization and repression. You don't get any compensation. So she appealed, and this was a many, many years of a case. She appealed, and the judgment that came back was like, you're right, it was wrong of us to say that you were not a victim of a violent crime because you're a sex worker. It's because you're an old sex worker. Had you been a young sex worker, new to the trade, had you been forced into it, then it wouldn't have been your fault. But look, by this time you should know. She appealed again, and she finally won, which was at a watershed moment because on a structural level, at the very least, we had gained a tiny, tiny margin of possibility of reporting violent crimes. Incidentally, once she won, welfare seized all the compensation money. I mention that because I think it's important to understand that when sex workers are doing sex work for an income, be it to survive on a very day-to-day basic level, or be it to provide for their children, or to provide for their rent, or to go to school, not only is the humiliation and the risk of being arrested by the police a deterrent from reporting violent crimes, the risk that your clients could be arrested, you could no longer make that income, which is allowing you to get by, is also a deterrent. And so the criminalization, the risk that you or your clients could be arrested is what keeping the violent perpetrators from being arrested. And as a result of that, we see an extremely high rate of murders of sex workers. We count at Stella 13 people that we know of since the past 12 years who were murdered, 2 of whom were Aboriginal, 1 of whom was trans. That accounts for something like 5% of the murder rate in Montreal. And it's completely systemically caused as far as we're concerned. Violence is not inherent to sex work. What is inherent, it's inherent to a system where there's total impunity for violence against sex workers.
At the South Asian Women's Community Center, most of the work that we do related to violence is what is generally termed domestic violence, interpersonal violence between partners and spouses. The vast majority of the victims are women, but there are also cases of elder abuse where parents, male and female, but often female because of the gender dynamic, might be threatened or assaulted by children. And also in terms of children who have been born and raised here within South Asian families, the use of violence or threats of violence to maintain certain kinds of traditional behaviors, or taking a child, the girl child, to a country like Pakistan or Bangladesh for a forced arranged marriage. So this is kind of quite a wide spectrum. Complicating these issues of violence, particularly in our work, are issues of culture and tradition, where norms are sort of upheld that this is our culture, this is what we do, these are the expectations, and both the perpetrators and the victims in these situations of violence have usually been socialized and acculturated within these systems. So, very often a victim might not see this as a problem, that this is what is doled out to her because she's a woman, or she, did not cook or clean or do things appropriately, and this is, what she would get, and there's no question